Welcome to Achkar Law's weekly webinar series, the Employment Law Essentials for Employers series. Today's topic is an exciting one and a very important one. We're going to be talking about eliminating bias in recruitment, interviews, and hiring, which might be a bit of a niche topic for those who don't realize the importance of making sure that bias is not only eliminated in the active workplace, but also at the time of hiring. We are Achkar Law. We have been operating since 2016. Our focus is on employment law, human rights, and workplace investigations, as well as civil, wrongful, and constructive dismissals. We also do have an active labor law group, and our bread and butter is litigation, with civil and corporate commercial being some of our primary topics there. We serve all of Ontario and beyond. Today's webinar will be hosted by myself. My name is Charles Miller. I'm a senior associate here at the firm. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Mariel Gerges, who's also a senior associate as well. Thank you very much, Mariel. So without further ado, let's dive right into this topic. Understanding bias in recruitment. Well, the first step to dealing with bias in recruitment is actually understanding what is bias altogether. So bias comes in actually many different forms. The most notable will be conscious bias, where somebody has an active distaste or an active preference for a certain group of people or a certain age range, a certain religious group, or a certain cultural group, and they tend to make hiring decisions based on that. That's one conscious bias. Or they might have a negative opinion about certain groups of people based on a protected ground, and they prefer not to hire people from that particular situation. Another type of bias is unconscious bias. So this is probably the most prolific form of bias. These are biases that are subconscious. People have no idea they might have them. And they could essentially come out of nowhere during the hiring process. Form of a conscious bias that may occur is affinity bias, where you tend to have a preference for somebody who shares similar traits to yourself. So if you're an extroverted person, you might like extroverted candidates. If you're an introverted person, you might prefer client or candidates who are a little more introverted, as well as other types of examinations where they're just similar to you. These biases that are unconscious, you don't know they're coming. The conscious ones are a little easier to spot, but the unconscious ones are a little bit harder to navigate. You don't necessarily know they're coming, but don't worry. Later on in this particular session, Mariel is going to talk all about the best hiring practices to avoid those. Now, the impact of bias is quite substantial to your company as well as to the liability your company might face. If bias isn't nipped in the bud or taken out of the root, it could impact just the type of people that you hire, so that you're actually either maybe leaning into affinity bias, or you're only hiring like-minded people who could ruin the diversity of ideas that go across your company. That can be quite problematic, as well as there's legal and ethical implication in biased hiring practices, such that your company could actually become liable for claims of discrimination if the bias is prominent in the hiring practice and isn't identified and dealt with right away. So not only does bias impact the nature of your company, potentially how successful it can be in the workplace, it could also open you up to all sorts of liability in terms of legal claims. And if your company is identified as one that has some biased hiring practices, it could impact your company's standing socially, just on the market and with the rest of society. Understanding that bias is quite problematic. From a social standpoint, we can all agree that having any sort of bias in hiring practices is quite problematic. But there's also legal implications and legal duties to make sure that the hiring or bias doesn't exist in your company at the hiring process, period. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Human Rights Code as well as the Employment Standards Act. They all deal with topics specifically with regards to the hiring practice. Federally, that also applies to the Canadian Human Rights Act as well as Canadian Labor Code. Those all indicate that hiring practices need to be eliminated of bias. Specifically with the Human Rights Code, Section 23 of the Canadian Human Rights Code actually targets specifically different ways you need to make sure that bias isn't present in the hiring practice. So under the Canadian Human Rights Code, if you've watched some of our other webinar series, you'll know that we talk about that there are certain protected grounds and certain protected social settings that if bias exists there or discrimination exists there, the company can be held liable. Those grounds could be anything from age, citizenry, ethnic group, family status, marital status. Those are all big no-nos. Those are things that people cannot face any sort of discrimination on. And if an employment includes also the hiring process as well, such that if you are exhibiting any signs of discrimination in the hiring practice, you could be liable legislatively for that. So there's a lot of key legal requirements to making sure that you're not discriminating. To be more specific, Section 23 Canadian Human Rights Code has 4 instances or 4 subsections that are really targeted. For instance, the ad itself, when you're posting a job and looking for feedback and employees to come in, the job ad itself cannot contain any sort of discriminatory language. But specifically, if you can imagine, there are certain business cultures across the globe where it's actually recommended to submit a photo of yourself along with your application. Well, in Ontario and Canada, big no, we don't do that here because how attractive someone is, how old someone is, what their gender is all revealed in a photograph. So you can't have that. That's something you cannot have. So the very job ad itself cannot ask for information or cannot present itself in a way that it could be construed as being discriminatory. The application process as well. So when someone's actually submitted the application and the forms they might need to fill out, because sometimes the application process is not just submit a CV or a resume. Sometimes there's forms you want them to fill out. There are tests you might want them to take. Any of those forms, if there's any sort of discriminatory language within there or ways for you to discern an aspect about themselves that could elicit information about a protected ground, you could be liable for bias. And then, notably, during the actual interview itself, the questions you ask directly need to make sure that you're not asking any discriminatory language itself. Because if you ask somebody even casually, hey, do you have any kids? Hey, are you married? Hey, what's your background? Anything like that that could demonstrate that you are prodding into a protected ground, and then they end up not getting the job. And there's any suspicion that the reason why they did not end up getting the job because of a bias against an answer they gave that was on a protected ground, your company could find themselves liable for a claim. And Canada federally has much the same process as we see here directly in Ontario. We now know legislatively that employers have to ensure a fair hiring process, not just to ensure their company is thriving and advancing, but also because the potential legal repercussions of non-compliance are quite substantial. If someone comes to our firm or to another firm to say that they believe that they face discrimination in the hiring process, that leads to a human rights application either federally or provincially. And the damages there fall under a category known as lost wages. This is distinct from a wrongful termination or constructive dismissal, where somebody is fired and not paid enough in recognition for their years of service or other factors, but that's largely tied to how long they've been with your company, such that if they've been with your company very long, you owe them more in terms of severance and entitlements, and they've been there very short, you owe them less. Lost wages works differently. The theory behind it is that I would have had this job, but for the discrimination I experienced, and now I've lost work because of it. So until this person finds new work, the one who's responsible for discrimination should be liable for however long it takes them to find a new job and recover from this discrimination. You could very well have a candidate who's never worked at your company a day in their lives, and you could find yourself liable for months, maybe years of lost wages because there was bias and discrimination at the hiring practice. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of desire to make sure that your hiring practices are completely avoided of any bias or any discrimination so that your company doesn't find themselves liable for these substantial damages. And the way to protect your company, and in terms of exploring those best practices, my colleague and friend Marielle is going to walk you through exactly how to keep your company safe and what those best practices are. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Marielle, who's going to go right into that topic.
Thank you, Charlie. Charlie's absolutely correct that he set the foundation for what actually is bias, and he's absolutely right that bias during the hiring process, as well as discrimination during this process, starts from the job posting or advertisement itself, whether it's posted on Indeed, LinkedIn, or the organization's own website. And the wording of the job description is important to help attract top quality talent. So the job posting should outline what the prospective employee could expect as part of the day-to-day in the role and the organization's values and expectations. A job posting can also provide an employee with valuable insight into the organization's culture, which is why removing bias in the advertisement is so important. Bias in the job posting can easily send a message unintentionally that the organization is not inclusive and could deter potentially qualified candidates. So by removing bias from the ad, you're not only reducing your potential exposure to liability, but you can also help reach a wider audience at the same time. Some best practices to drafting bias-free job descriptions include avoiding gendered language. So for instance, if the job posting only uses he when describing a successful candidate, like he will report to the project manager on a daily basis, or he will ensure that the workspace is kept in a tidy manner, and so on, it subconsciously sends a message that perhaps females will not be considered for the role. Sometimes during hiring, interviewers lean more towards candidates that they have something in common with, which Charlie described as affinity bias, such as similar life experiences like completing a program at a specific school or growing up in the same city or town. That interview can feel a lot more friendly, help you feel connected to the person who has that similar experience. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the most qualified candidate for the role. It's important to be mindful about subconscious bias or cultural or background bias in this regard. Some job postings will also specify that they only consider Canadian experience, except when clearly required by certain industry requirements or regulatory bodies. This language can actually prevent an organization from hiring a great applicant who maybe has some experience outside of Canada. We spoke about eliminating bias at the job description stage, but let's get a little bit into a couple more ways to eliminate bias throughout the hiring process itself. So the organization puts out a job description, and now prospective candidates are applying. The next step is to look at bias occurring when actually reviewing those applications or resumes. One way to eliminate bias is to implement anonymized resume screening. Focus more on the contents of the resume before looking at, for instance, the potential employee's name or their address, or providing your requirements to a recruiter who then can send you a few candidates to interview based on the criteria provided to them. Before reaching out to interview potential candidates, make a structure for the hiring process. For instance, will there be 2 interviews? Will they both be virtual? Or would the organization prefer to have a final interview in person? Who will conduct each stage of the interview? Be clear about the interview process before meeting with a candidate. And while putting together a plan for the hiring process, ask, what does your business actually need? For instance, if the role will be involved in a collaborative environment, being personable and being able to work successfully on a team is going to be important for that employee's contribution in your organization. So your business may want to tailor some questions to test a candidate's ability to work in a team environment. The questions to test out key elements for the role should be asked to all individuals during their interview. Have a short list of important qualities in mind before starting an interview, and it'll help your business objectively assess whether the candidate may or may not be a good fit. Your business can also give candidates, for instance, a sample task or assignment. It's a way to objectively assess their output or quality of work. An effective tool to help interviewers is to implement training, including bias training, before scheduling interviews. Unconscious bias training has several benefits. It helps interviewers and hiring managers recognize their own bias, reflect on how their biases impact their thoughts and behaviors, and provides objective tools and best practices. Bias when it comes to certain human rights code grounds, like Charlie mentioned, such as age, religion, gender, disability, just to name a few, it can actually expose to an organization to liability or discrimination damages, which can be quite extensive, even if the employee has not worked a day for your organization. Unconscious bias training can help the person hiring catch their own biases during an interview before they act on that bias. It can also help a hiring manager challenge their own internal assumptions to assess a candidate based on what they actually bring to the table instead of what the interviewer assumes what they can bring to the table. Taking steps to eliminate bias does not end at the interview stage. Employers can take very simple steps to create a culture of awareness and improvement. And here's a few examples here. For instance, leading by example. So if you catch a male colleague speaking over his female counterpart, after he's done, make a point to speak up and say that you wanted to hear what she has to say. It's a small way to lead by example, but it makes a massive difference over time. Implement and enforce policies in promoting inclusivity or anti-discrimination. And if an employee, for instance, complains about being treated different or poorly by their colleagues or describing microaggressions that they face at work, investigate it and take it seriously. It could be a sign of a larger issue within the workplace with more work to be done. Key steps to create a more inclusive and hiring process starts at the job description. Be mindful of the language used in the job ad. Do its contents actually reflect an inclusive workplace? The next area to eliminate bias comes from assessing interviews and applications. Does your business have a standardized way of evaluating resumes? Are the steps from the initial interview up until the job offer made? Are they clearly laid out? Our biases can evolve as we do, so it's important to continuously alter, evaluate, and improve your business's hiring practices. And as always, we recommend seeking professional legal advice from experienced employment lawyers for solutions tailored to your unique situation.
Very good. Thank you so much for that, Marielle. Expected, you've got quite a few questions that have come in. And so, Marielle, first question for you. Can a candidate be rejected if they refuse to turn on their camera during interviews, as the face by itself could lead to bias discrimination?
That's a great question. As with most answers, most questions to lawyers, the answer is obviously going to be, it depends. Is it one interview out of four? Has the potential candidate given a reason for refusing to turn on their camera? It could be as easy as there's some type of accommodation that needs to be put in place. So I would say reach out to one of our experienced lawyers. We can help provide some more guidance on that point.
Thank you. Are there any situations when biased hiring practices are appropriate, such as working with vulnerable children and not wanting to hire someone with a criminal background?
So that would be known as a bona fide work requirement. And the short answer to that is yes, but with a lot of caveats. For instance, Charlie and myself, we are licensed lawyers. To practice law in Ontario, we require a license. For individuals that have a licensed role, there is a bona fide requirement to have an active license to complete that job duty. And there is actually some case law as well that says not having a criminal background with crime related to children may be a requirement for those working with small children or youth at risk. So a criminal background alone, not necessarily, but it does depend on what shows up in the criminal record check. One of the grounds in the Human Rights Code is actually a criminal record. So I would say be very careful before choosing not to hire an employee based on what shows up on their background check. But again, it's something that I would say reach out to an experienced lawyer to assist you with.
If the candidate offers information about themselves, such as talking about their kids or their home country without prompting, could I still be in trouble for biased hiring?
That's going to depend on where the conversation goes next. For instance, if the candidate applies and it says very clear on their resume, they spent 6 months traveling the world. Pretty easy, interesting topic will be, well, where did you go? That's a little bit different than focusing on the employee's, the prospective employee's culture or where they grew up. It's appropriate to engage in some level of conversation to vet out a candidate while also making sure the questions being asked don't cross the line into anything that may be seen as judgmental or talking down to an individual, more so just a curiosity.
Employers are aware of the ad application interview process, but ageism for the older person is very rampant in our workplace. And this is evidenced by the fact that many older people are not hired. How do we address this?
It's an excellent question. Age discrimination is a tale as old as time. There is a ton of case law to show that even when the employee is working with the employer, trying to let them go by a certain age or asking questions about their retirement plans is blatant discrimination. It's also not allowed in Ontario. If a candidate feels as though they've been discriminated against because of their age, I would strongly encourage them to talk to a lawyer about their potential options there.
How often should I, as the employer, implement anti-bias training?
At a minimum, the recommendation would be at least once a year to get everyone up to date, especially, that's a relatively arbitrary number. For instance, if your hiring manager leaves partway through the year and you bring someone else on, it might be a good idea to implement that training sooner rather than later. But generally, we would say once a year, refresh all employees on internal policies, get everyone up to date. If there's any amendments, make sure to point out those amendments as well.
And that leads well into the next question. How often should I update my anti-bias training? With the new understanding of gender identification is still evolving, we want to keep pace.
Our recommendation would be at least once a year as well, especially for the younger workforce that are coming in or potentially the older workforce that maybe had less exposure to some of the content in that training based on their social circumstances at the time.
Absolutely. And to build off of what Mariel's saying, as we know, like once a year is really the recommendation, but the law does change very quickly sometimes. Sometimes it can be very slow, sometimes it can be very quick. So it's good to have a lawyer in your back pocket, somebody who is keeping their fingers on the pulse as legislation and case law updates, so that if something new comes across, we can let you know, because sometimes an update might be required within 6 months if we find something that just all of a sudden comes across legislation, or if there's new updates or a case law that comes about. So once a year is the recommendation, but always good to have an employment lawyer nearby so that we can keep you up to date as well.
Thank you, Charlie.
Is there any problem with affinity bias if I actually want like-minded people to join my company?
That's going to depend on what the bias is tailored towards. If, for instance, it's a tricky line to tread. If the requirement is that the person grew up in your hometown, it's going to be unjustifiable to start only hiring candidates who grew up, for instance, within a certain area because you know all the same streets. It's not a bona fide work requirement, and your business might actually suffer by not hiring the most qualified candidate for that role. If you start discriminating against potential candidates based on something under the Human Rights Code, you then expose your business to liability in that regard.
How does this impact if I want to actually hire a family member for a role?
I would talk to a lawyer before hiring a family member for the role right away. There might be some issues there that the job advertisement that's put up, if one is put up, may not have been genuine in the first place.
That's all the questions we have submitted. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today in our weekly webinar series. We will be having another one next week. Feel free to contact us if you have any follow-up questions or you want to explore more ways to keep your company safe from potential claims for bias in or unfair hiring practices. That's our contact information there. Thank you once again to everybody who joined us today. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you next week.